All right, so are you ready to like really tackle the origins of humanity? Because today we're going way beyond, that simple story we always hear, like caveman make tool. We're diving into a theory that's,
Fascinating.
yeah, fascinating, but also
A little unsettling.
a little unsettling for sure.
Yeah, it's amazing how often our ideas about, where humans came from are based on like assumptions instead of hard evidence.
And that's where Boris Porshnev comes in, right?
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive on this book he wrote back in 1973 on the beginning of human history, problems of paleopsychology. I mean, this guy,
He throws out some really radical ideas.
he really does about how early humans talk to each other, how they interacted, like what even makes us human to begin with.
Yeah, he kind of like shakes up everything, even questions whether we can even say there was a single beginning to human history.
Yeah, he's not into just saying, okay, tool use equals human or big brain equals human. He's looking for something more, like
A qualitative leap.
exactly, a qualitative leap, not just gradual changes.
He says that just focusing on physical stuff like tool use or brain size, you miss the whole point. He's got this great story about Catholic university professors.
Wait, what does that have to do with human evolution?
Okay, so these professors are writing a paleontology textbook, right? And they have to get it approved by the archbishop.
Okay.
And Porshniev's point is that even science, something that's supposed to be objective, can be influenced by totally different viewpoints. The archbishop wanted to make sure the textbook agreed with religious doctrine, see how personal beliefs can totally change how we understand stuff, even science.
Yeah. Okay. I see where he's going with that.
Yeah.
So if it's not just tools and brains, what does make us human, according to this guy?
Get ready for this one. He calls it the troglodyte theory.
Yeah.
Basically, he says early humans, we're talking like Australopithecus all the way to Neanderthals. They were a separate family from us, Homo sapiens. He calls them troglodytids.
Troglodytes.
Yeah, and he says they were really good with tools, but they didn't have actual speech.
No speech at all.
And they weren't really social in the way we understand it.
Quite pre-social. But I thought like early humans always hung out in groups.
Yeah, they did form groups, yeah, but Porshnev says those groups weren't based on the same complex social stuff that we have, like real communication and social structures.
So if they weren't really social, how did they like function at all as a group?
This is where things get really interesting. He thinks the very first human communication wasn't about sharing information. It was about something he calls interdiction.
Interdiction. I've never heard that word before.
Think of it as the power to forbid or command just with signals. The original no.
So it's less about telling someone something and more about just controlling them.
Exactly. And he has this really cool example to show what he means. He did an experiment with his own dog. He trained the dog to make a certain signal when it wanted to go outside.
Okay, I'm listening.
Then he started ignoring that signal on purpose, just to see how the dog would react.
And what happened? Did the dog just give up?
Not at all. The dog went into what Porshnev called an ultra-paradoxical state. It started acting all weird, doing stuff it had never done before. Porshnev thought this was because the dog really wanted to go outside, but it was being blocked, like a no was stopping it. So that blocked desire, like, forced its way out in all these strange ways.
So even ignoring a command is still communicating something.
Powerful stuff, right? Now, think about this in terms of early humans. Porshnev suggests this power of interdiction, of saying no, was super important for their evolution, especially for, and this is where it gets a little creepy, for dealing with cannibalism.
Whoa, hold on. Cannibalism. Where did that come from?
Porshnev has this pretty controversial idea. He thinks troglodytids didn't just do cannibalism when they were desperate, but they used it as a kind of regulated food source.
Regulated, like it wasn't just random.
That's what he's suggesting. He says that because food was scarce and they had to survive, they might have developed this practice. But the key thing is he thinks this is what pushed them to develop interdiction.
So no was like the rule book for cannibalism.
You could say that he thinks the ability to forbid cannibalism, to create boundaries around it, that might have been the thing that really kicked off early communication. Imagine that the need to stop people from eating each other is what pushed us towards language.
That's definitely not how I ever pictured it. So we've got these troglodytids. They're smart, they use tools, but they're not really social the way we think of it. And their main form of talking is basically just no. And maybe the reason they developed this no was to keep from, eating each other.
It's a lot more complicated than that old caveman make tool story, isn't it? But this is just the beginning. Porshnev goes on to explain how this primal no, this interdiction, turned into something much more sophisticated.
Okay, I'm ready for more. How do we get from no to actual language to, sharing ideas and meanings and all that.
Well, Porshnev thinks interdiction slowly changed into suggestion. It's still about influencing people, but in a subtler way with words.
So like from ordering someone around to persuading them.
Exactly. But think about it. Yes, you hear there's always a possible no behind it, right? The power to suggest something still has that echo of a command. It's fascinating how he connects these two things, yes and no, even though they seem opposite.
It's like when you see an ad, right? They're not forcing you to buy something, but they're definitely suggesting it. And every suggestion is like a yes with a hidden no if you don't go along with it.
Exactly. Porshnev would say this power of suggestion, it's built into how humans communicate, even today.
Okay, but if words started out as just commands and suggestions, how did they ever get real meaning? How did we get to the kind of language we have now?
He thinks symbolic meaning came about gradually because of this power of suggestion. He uses the example of proper nouns. He says they started out as specific prohibitions like don't touch this thing. But as people kept using them in different situations, they started to represent those things in a broader way.
So just by using these words, even as commands, they became like labels for things.
That's the idea. And then from there, abstract thought started to develop. And eventually we get to the complex language we have today.
It's kind of wild to think that language, something we use all the time, might have come from this like primal urge to control things and make suggestions.
It really changes how you think about human progress, doesn't it? But there's another piece of the puzzle. Mimicry, Porshnev says, our ability to copy each other was super important for spreading both interdiction and early speech.
I can see how mimicking would help spread things around, but how did it help language actually evolve?
He noticed that people with microcephaly, they have smaller heads and brains, they tend to mimic a lot, and their brains are similar in some ways to the brains of troglodytids.
So by studying them, we're kind of looking back in time.
Exactly. It's like a reminder that understanding human evolution, it's not just about digging up fossils. We have to look in all sorts of places for clues, even places that seem totally unrelated at first.
This deep dive is blowing my mind. I'm looking at the world and even myself in a whole new way.
That's the power of questioning assumptions, right? But we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to explore about Porshnev's theory and what it means for human history and even how we act today.
Well, I'm ready to dive deeper. This is incredible.
We were talking about how Porshnev thinks real human history, like the explosion of culture and technology that didn't happen until after we had this foundation of interdiction and suggestion.
So all that stuff we think of as civilization, like art, fancy tools, farming, all that came after, a system of basically command and control communication. I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that.
It is a radical idea, isn't it? He thinks that interdictive past is what allowed us to develop abstract thought, the meaning of symbols, and eventually all the ways we shape the world around us.
Okay, but here's what I don't get. If our earliest interactions were all about no and control, how did we ever develop things like empathy and altruism and cooperation? Don't those seem pretty important for building a civilization?
Yeah, that's a question Porshnev wrestles with, too. He says those more positive social behaviors didn't just appear out of nowhere. They took a long time to develop, and they were kind of a response to all the problems that interdiction itself caused.
Okay, pretend I'm a troglodyte who just figured out how to say yes.
Yeah.
Break it down for me.
Imagine a world where communication is mostly about limits and what you're not allowed to do. You're constantly hearing no, your actions are restricted, all your impulses are being suppressed. Not exactly a recipe for feeling all warm and fuzzy inside, is it?
Sounds more like a recipe for a prehistoric meltdown.
Probably a lot of that going around. But Porshnev says this created this pressure cooker for human evolution. He thinks empathy developed as a survival strategy in this super restrictive environment.
So we had to learn to get along because the alternative was just too much chaos.
Exactly. He sees cooperation not as some kind of inherent goodness, but as a way to survive, a way to reduce the conflict that a system of no and dominance would naturally create.
It's like that whole survival of the fittest idea, but flipped on its head. It's not just about being the strongest, it's about being the best at getting along.
That's it. And this leads to another really cool part of Porshnev's theory. He thinks suggestion didn't just shape what we did, it shaped our sense of right and wrong, too.
Wait, you're saying our morality could be influenced by this ancient system of command and control?
He's not saying all morality comes from outside, but he thinks maybe our earliest ideas about good and bad came from the suggestive power of language, from all those no's that shaped how we acted.
My mind is officially blown. So if this theory is so revolutionary, why haven't I ever heard of it before? Why isn't Porshnev like a household name?
That's a great question. And it gets to why Porshnev work is so controversial. Some people think he was a genius, a visionary who dared to think differently. Others think he was just a quack with crazy ideas.
What makes it so controversial? Is it just because his ideas are hard to believe?
Well, some of them are definitely hard to swallow, like that whole regulated cannibalism thing. But I think part of it is that he pulls from so many different fields like paleontology, psychology, linguistics, even history and philosophy.
So he's not just shaking up science, he's shaking up how we even learn about stuff.
Exactly. And that's what makes him so interesting. Even if you don't agree with him, he makes you think about the messy reality of human evolution. The good, the bad, the weird.
You weren't kidding when you said this deep dive would be disturbing. It's not just the cannibalism, it's this idea that so much of what we think of as human might come from something so primal, so negative.
It does make you question things, doesn't it? If our earliest way of talking was all about control, are we still carrying that with us today? Do we see traces of this interdictive past in the world around us?
Those are some deep questions. I don't know if I have the answers, but I'm not so sure what it means to be human anymore.
Mm.
And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe being a little unsure is the best way to start trying to understand something as big and mysterious as where we came from. So we've talked about a lot, right? Like going from interdiction to suggestion and how those things shape the way early humans talk to each other and even like where our ideas of right and wrong come from. But I'm still kind of stuck on this. How did those early interactions where it was all about no and being in charge, how did that lead to the complex societies and all the cooperation that we see in humans today? It seems like a huge jump.
It's a question that's puzzled people forever. Porshnev has a really unique take on how that happened. He thinks the limits of interdiction itself are what created the conditions for a totally new kind of social interaction.
Wait, really? How does saying no all the time lead to anything besides people getting pissed off and fighting?
Think back to those troglodyte groups, right? They're trying to make it in a world where there isn't a lot of food or resources.
Hmm.
And with interdiction, this ability to command and forbid, you'd have a really structured environment. Clear hierarchies limits on what you can and can't do.
So kind of like a caveman boot camp.
Yeah, something like that. And Porshnev says in that system, cooperation becomes less of a choice and more of something you have to do. The ones who could figure out how to work within that system, following orders, anticipating commands, working together within the rules, they were the ones who survived.
So interdiction didn't magically turn into altruism. It's more like the pressure of this really restrictive environment forced people to develop ways to get along.
You got it. He sees cooperation as an adaptation, a way to balance out all the potential chaos and conflict that comes with a system built on dominance. And no, it's like the act of saying no created the need for a way to say yes, but only within the limits of that system.
That's trippy. But how do we get from that early cooperation that was almost like forced to the genuine empathy and altruism that we see today? That's a long way from don't eat your neighbor to let's build a hospital.
Porshnev says those complex emotions developed over time and they're connected to the evolution of language. As interdiction changed into suggestion and words started to have symbolic meaning, people got better at understanding each other's internal states.
So we're not just following orders anymore. We're starting to understand why someone's saying no, what their motivation is.
Exactly. And that's what opens the door to empathy. He says that as we got better at communicating our own needs, we also became more sensitive to the needs of other people. It's like language created this feedback loop where our minds and our emotions evolved together.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all this fits together, but it still seems like such a huge change from those early troglodytes who were all about survival and control to humans who make art and build cities and write poetry.
It's a pretty amazing transformation, right? But Porshnev reminds us that evolution isn't a straight line. It's messy, unpredictable, full of surprises. He thinks the seeds of our creativity, our ability for abstract thought, they were there even in those early, seemingly simple ways of communicating.
So even saying no, even forbidding something had the potential for something more.
It did. He sees this tension between the limits of interdiction and our human urge to break free from those limits. It's like by saying no to one thing, we opened up the possibility of saying yes to something totally new and unexpected.
You know, I think there's a part of us way deep down that's still wired for that no thinking, even when we're trying to connect and cooperate. Maybe it's part of what makes us human, this back and forth between control and creativity.
That's definitely something to think about Porshnev's theory. Even though it's tough to grasp sometimes and kind of scary, it forces us to face the whole truth of our evolutionary past. It reminds us that our journey from those early troglodytes to who we are today is full of surprises, contradictions, and maybe even some echoes of that primal no still with us after all this time.
Well, after this deep dive, I'm looking at humanity in a whole new way. Even if you don't agree with everything Porshnev says, his ideas make you rethink our origins, how we act, even language itself. It's giving me a lot to ponder, that's for sure.
That's the amazing thing about these big questions, isn't it? They leave you with more questions than answers, a sense of wonder, and a much deeper appreciation for just how long, strange, and surprising the journey of human